Hiya! For absolutely no reason whatsoever, we thought it might be a great time to tell you about some fantasy RPGs. The classic sword and sorcery approach to the fantasy genre isn't relegated only to D&D. For anyone who wants to explore far-off worlds filled with magic and danger, we can offer you a few alternatives. Here are 9 fantasy TTRPGs that you might not know about. Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The fantasy world of Pathfinder is a refreshingly diverse one. The original Pathfinder was born directly out of Dungeons & Dragons' lineage, a spiritual successor to the game's 3.5 edition. That built on top of the gameplay and storytelling established by the Dragon game, while also updating various parts of its decades-old foundation, and adding its own unique ideas. Its blend of familiar and fresh proved a hit among players, leading to the fantasy RPG becoming a success in its own right. A decade later, Pathfinder's own 2nd edition revised the game to streamline a number of its rules, such as making combat turns easier, and revisiting the options available for players when making their characters. They also reduced the restriction of characters' ancestries and allowed players to spec their characters' skills in the direction they want with minimal limitation. The result is a version of Pathfinder that's easier for newcomers to get into, without losing the gameplay complexity embedded at its core by its underlying tie to Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. The rulebook is still a comprehensive tome of actions, spells, and world-building ideas, but using individual rules on the table is faster and easier than ever. The game's popularity has also led to a wealth of adventures, sourcebooks, and other material both official and fan-made released over the last decade plus, with the added ability to use D&D books thanks to its shared rule set. Pathfinder 2nd Edition manages to offer a solid fantasy RPG alternative to Dungeons & Dragons 5e, for those who miss the chewier rules of old, without feeling overly dated or off-putting to those taking their first steps into role-playing. Romance of the Perilous Land. The name of this role-playing game might imply that players will be courting royals, knights, and maybe even a couple of sorcerers. But that's not what the romance in Romance of the Perilous Land is referring to. Instead, the term romance is used to describe a certain genre of literature or art that focuses on the medieval values of chivalric love, adventure, and being willing to put the safety of others before your own. Romance of the Perilous Land takes place in a world inspired by Arthurian myths and Anglo-Saxon tales, but an inclusive one that includes diverse groups and enables players to make characters that reflect their own attributes. Rather than focusing on the traditional swords and sorcery angle of fantasy, such as D&D, Romance encourages players to indulge in the wonders of the world they're exploring and how they can help the people that populate it. All of the player characters in Romance are morally good people who seek to fight evil on behalf of key figures such as King Arthur, Merlin, or even Robin Hood, with the party heading off to defeat wrongdoers and restore peace. Similarly to D&D 5e, player characters use their various attributes alongside a d20 in order to overcome various skill checks. However, unlike D&D 5e, players in Romance want to roll equal to or under a certain number if their character is to be successful in their endeavors. Players are free to create characters from a range of classes, such as Knight, Ranger, and Thief, which will enable them to perform better at certain tasks than others, as well as do cool things such as casting spells or sick acrobatics. Outside of its gameplay mechanics, the real draw of Romance is its setting and approach to questing. Rather than pursuing certain quests for their own benefit, player characters in Romance are embarking on missions for their own sake and for the sake of others. Prepare to embody chivalric values in Romance of the Perilous Land. Heart, the City Beneath. Heart, the City Beneath is filled with all sorts of terrors and strange beings. After winning about 1 million Emmy Awards, it seems silly not to at least mention Heart, the City Beneath on this list. This game is absolutely deserving of all the praise it's gotten. Heart was created by duo Christopher Taylor and Grant Howitt, the designer of the infamous Honey Heist RPG, in which players are criminal bears. This role-playing game is a sort of sister title to a previous RPG from Taylor and Howitt, by the name of Spire, in which all high elves in a fantastical city are horrible, racist bastards. Some of the city's less fortunate inhabitants have escaped into the unknowable eldritch nightmare that is the city beneath. Mechanically, Heart uses a pretty straightforward system in which you'll be collecting pools of d10s and determining the result of your actions based on whatever your highest result is. Your character has things that they're good at and domains in which they thrive. For each one you have that's relevant, you'll add more dice to your pool. It's got a few nuances, like the multiple types of stress you can suffer, but in general it should be pretty easy for newer players to wrap their head around, especially with an experienced game master. Outside of the obviously fantastic world building that the book has throughout, the thing that shines the most in Heart is the cast of characters you'll be able to create. From the buzzing bee witch, known as the Deep Apiarist, the body-altering cleaver that takes the idiom "you are what you eat" disturbingly literally. The character classes in Heart are so fantastically specific. Despite the standard fantasy backdrop that the world of Heart and Spire suspend themselves in, these games couldn't be any further from the standard fantasy fare. If you're looking for something truly different and wonderfully evocative, then the world of Heart awaits you with open tentacles. Pendragon. Player characters are members of King Arthur's court, and most uphold his codes. As well as its setting's roots in classic Arthurian folklore, fantasy RPG Pendragon has its own link to role-playing royalty, emerging from the mind of one of the most influential RPG designers of all time, Greg Stafford, a key figure behind 1970s fantasy RPG RuneQuest and the hugely influential horror RPG Call of Cthulhu. Considered Stafford's magnum opus and the late designer's own favourite among his many games, Pendragon is still a fantasy RPG like no other, almost 40 years after it first hit tables. The game is set in a fantasy world steeped in the legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Like Arthur's Knights, players set out on quests based around political or spiritual pursuits, rather than prowling the closest dungeon for loot. Rather than conventional stats, such as dexterity and strength, characters are created through a combination of virtues and passions, which influence how they may act in certain situations, and open up the potential for temptation and failure as they remain beholden to ideas such as honor, like in traditional Arthurian stories. Pendragon's most unique and inventive element is its multi-generational storytelling, which allows players to live out the lives of multiple characters over a number of years and generations, possibly even playing the descendants of their previous characters. While fantastical adventures are a key part of the RPG, just as important are aspects such as romance, marriage, and everyday life between quests. Something rarely seen in RPGs such as D&D. Pendragon's epic scope and complex painting of a fantasy historical world remain unmatched even today. The game has seen a number of editions over the years. Its latest full release is an updated version of its 5th edition, with a 6th iteration described as Stafford's Ultimate Edition, due for release in the future. A set of preview rules is currently available. Mörk Borg. Whilst many fantasy role-playing games are designed to enable their players an escape from their dreary, mundane lives, Mörk Borg offers no such thing. Released to critical acclaim in 2020, winning 2 prestigious Emmy Awards for Product of the Year and Best Writing, Mörk Borg presents a world that is finally coming to its end, after a long and brutal history of violence, tragedy, and death. The aim of playing Mörk Borg isn't necessarily to win, it's more about trying to find a glimmer of redemption in an otherwise miserable and cruel universe. This feeling is effectively conveyed through the rulebook's striking art style and gruesome descriptions. It is also communicated through Mörk Borg's rather unforgiving gameplay system that is more than willing and able to inflict all sorts of harm on the player characters. See, characters in Mörk Borg aren't good people, per se, but they could be at least trying to get better. But this is made exponentially more difficult by the Calendar of Necrobell, a system that gradually tracks the terrible series of events leading up to the end of the world. This includes a bestiary of terrifying creatures ready to kill, and systems that govern elements such as the collection of occult powers player characters can perform, with failure resulting in catastrophes of immense proportions. But that's the main appeal of playing Mörk Borg, the potential for things to go incredibly wrong. You can't go into playing this RPG without the complete understanding that your character will fail in the most tragic way. But once you've accepted your character's fate, then you can really begin embracing the misery and terror that Mörk Borg instills in its players. Mörk Borg is actually a refreshing change from the normal fantasy RPG experience, one that is unlikely to leave your head anytime soon. The One Ring role-playing game, 2nd edition. Elves, hobbits, dwarves, wizards, and more populate the land of Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings sits alongside D&D as one of the key influences on countless modern fantasy RPGs today, and fantasy as a whole, for better and worse. So it's only natural that Tolkien's epic tale of hobbits, magical rings, and long journeys across Middle-earth has been adapted for the tabletop. The latest outing for the Lord of the Rings in role-playing form is the One Ring 2nd edition, an update to the standalone RPG first published by Cubicle 7 more than a decade ago. For those looking to explore Middle-earth using the familiar rules of D&D 5e, the Separate Adventures in Middle-earth sourcebook has you covered. Now in the hands of Tales from the Loop and Alien the RPG studio Free League, the One Ring 2e updates the original game's rules while shifting the focus of its well-trodden setting to Eriador, the region of Middle-earth that includes the Hobbit home of the Shire. While players can still embark on epic quests like those of Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring, the One Ring typically puts more weight on smaller drama and encounters than events spanning the whole of Middle-earth. The game's adventure phase sees players dealing with encounters, whether by fighting or less violent means, before they rest up and prepare during the separate Fellowship phase. As you'd expect from a game steeped in Tolkien's work, there's plenty of time spent on the road as a party, with a set of travel rules making treks across Middle-earth as important and memorable as battles or puzzles. The players can even encounter familiar faces from the Lord of the Rings, whether they're sponsoring the party's travels, with possible partners including Bilbo and Gandalf, or gathered through dedicated rules for holding councils, like the Fellowship's meeting in Rivendell. The One Ring is the ideal RPG for those looking to venture back into a familiar fantasy world, while also getting the chance to discover and explore new corners of Middle-earth as their own creations. In many ways, fantasy RPGs don't get much more fantasy than this. Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, Soulbound. Each faction in Soulbound has their own distinct perspectives and abilities. Warhammer Fantasy might be the most recognizable of the miniatures series RPG spin-offs, but it's certainly not the only one worth taking a look at. Based in the universe of skirmish game Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, Soulbound sees players becoming pawns in the games of leaders and gods far mightier than themselves. Age of Sigmar is a universe made up of the mortal realms, which are 8 different worlds, some inspired by magic, others more by steampunk or horror, each populated by people and monsters alike. While the common folk struggle to survive, the deities and rulers of each realm are in almost constant conflict with one another, with the player characters charged with exploring these lands to fulfill the wishes of the world's more merciful gods. Becoming soulbound means tethering yourself to other people in your order, ensuring that as long as someone is still alive, everyone else can come back from death. As members of the newly revived Soulbound Order, the player characters will be protected from Nagash, god of death, through the souls of their comrades. This concept adds weight to player characters' bonds with one another by making the saying, "putting my life in your hands," quite literal. The universe of Age of Sigmar is a dark and dangerous place, meaning that sometimes the only light that someone can find is with their friends and companions. It's funny how such a gritty and morose world can inspire such compassion. When creating their characters, players will be able to choose from a variety of different archetypes, based on the rival factions that call the mortal realms their home, from the righteous Stormcast Eternals to the strange Deepkin, and actual sentient trees. There is plenty of opportunity to make a party of absolute weirdos that somehow find common ground with one another, simply because they have to. Start your journey into the world of Age of Sigmar with this Soulbound RPG. Mausritter. Mausritter's oversized domestic world is undeniably charming. Swap Dungeons and Dragons for rurality and rodents, and you end up with Mausritter. Isaac Williams' delightful fantasy RPG follows in the paw prints of classic tales such as Redwall, role-playing game Mouse Guard, and board game Mice and Mystics, as players become little mice on a big adventure. Mausritter's gameplay builds on the system used in indie title Into the Odd, part of the OSR, Old School Renaissance, genre of role-playing games, inspired by early days of D&D and other 1970s RPGs. Compared to the crunchy rules of early D&D, however, Mausritter is a decidedly beginner-friendly experience with a much lighter set of rules for players to learn. The game uses a clever inventory system, where equipment such as armor and weapons, along with other items collected on players' journeys, are physical tiles that fill a limited number of squares on their character sheet, making it easy to track how much your character can carry without complicated encumbrance rules. Negative effects such as exhaustion can also take up slots, providing a way of adding interesting gameplay and storytelling complications without pages of rules to remember. Resolving tests is just as simple, with just 3 core traits, strength, dexterity, and will, that are checked against a single d20 roll. Mausritter's inventive magic system lets players mice cast spells, recharging their uses through a series of rituals that are often entertaining, such as giving a cat a gift it truly desires, balancing its charming theme and setting with beginner-friendly gameplay, and an inventive twist on classic role-playing, all in the space of a few dozen pages. Mausritter is a fantastic RPG that's ideal for players looking to return to the days of early D&D, or those brand new to the hobby. It's sure to set your whiskers twitching. The Witcher tabletop RPG. Geralt of Rivia is far from the only recognizable character name-dropped in the Witcher TTRPG. The Witcher franchise has certainly gotten a lot more popular over the last decade or so. Originally released as a series of fantasy novels by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski in the 1980s, the books were eventually adapted into a trilogy of video games, culminating in The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt, which is considered to be one of the best RPG video games of all time. Now that its Netflix series has reached its 2nd season, there's never been a better time to get into the Witcher franchise in every way you can, including a tabletop role-playing game from the publisher behind the cyberpunk TTRPG series. The Witcher TTRPG takes place in a fantasy world populated by humans, elves, dwarves, sorcerers, and monsters. Once a relatively normal medieval land, the continent became the landing zone for portals which brought in all sorts of strange beings and creatures. Players control characters living in the world during the middle of the Third Nilfgaardian War, a huge conflict that drags rulers and ordinary folk alike into it. Whilst the titular Witcher himself, Geralt of Rivia, is off recovering his memories and searching for his lost adopted child, the player characters are free to pursue their own various adventures. The beauty of the Witcher RPG is that players aren't tied into exploring any set paths. Instead, they can choose to get involved in both enormous questlines like the Nilfgaardian War, or incredibly local concerns like a village that's getting terrorized by some meddlesome creatures. Whilst players can create their own Witcher character, people who have undergone brutal experiments to prepare them for monster hunting, they can also make a pretty standard soldier, or a craftsperson, or a sorcerer, or even a travelling bard, if they fancied following around a grumpy Witcher themselves. Playing the Witcher RPG is a great way to discover more about the world outside of Geralt's own adventures, with there being more than enough to do considering the sheer size of the continent and its possibilities. So that was 9 fantasy TTRPGs that might be fun for you to play right now, for no particular reason. You can find a few referral links to each of these in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, you can find more content like this over on our website, Dicebreaker.com. If you like this video, you can also like and subscribe to see more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day. Bye!